evening and welcome to this special Anzac Day edition of Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and answering your questions tonight, social commentator and feminist Eva Cox, Executive Director of the Australia Defence Association Neil James, former Australian Army Major Martina Jewell, who was badly injured while serving with UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, Afghan refugee Najeeba Wazifadost, who arrived in Australia by boat in September of 2000, and the former head of the Australian Defence Colleges, who ran the war in Iraq for 2 years as Chief of Coalition Operations, Major General Jim Molan. Please welcome our panel. OK, well, Q&A is live from 9:35 Eastern Time. It's simulcast on ABC News 24 and Australia Network. And you can go to our website to send your questions and join the Twitter conversation by using the hashtag that's just appearing on your screen. Well, the lead-up to this Anzac Day has been clouded by the Skype scandal surrounding the Australian Defence Force Academy, where a group of recruits watched two of their colleagues having sex in a nearby room through a video link. And our first question tonight comes from Maha Abid.
Good evening, Tony. My question is for Eva tonight. Why is the real issue of the sexual mistreatment of women clouded by innuendos about their character and their personal lives?
Indeed, that's a really difficult question because it's something we've been trying to fix for a very long time. There's an assumption, and you could see it really clearly in the way that this was handled, that women ask for it, that they are not actually... I think it goes back to sort of some of the mythologies about Adam and Eve. It was all Eve's fault. So I still think they tend to blame women for things where they're not really to blame.
Where did you take that assumption from?
Me?
Yes. Why do you think that assumption was made?
That it was all Eve's fault, because the Bible told us so. We have to believe it, don't we?
Let's go to more contemporary times and deal with the ADFA scandal.
The ADFA scandal, well, because... I mean, it was interesting because the fact that they released the other information about the fact she'd been, you know, drunk and leave without, and on leave without permission or whatever, AWOL, etc., immediately set it up as, this is not a girl that's behaving well, so therefore she must have been asking for it. And it comes up all the time when you're talking about issues around rape and about whether people consent. There's a whole sort of set of assumptions behind it. There's an assumption that men don't do anything wrong, but it's the women that tempt them to some degree, or the women do the wrong things. So still, we've very much got a double standard. And I don't quite know how we fix it. I've been trying to do it for the last 40 years, and I think we've got a hell of a long way to go, and I think this is another illustration of it.
Let's ask Neil James. Do you agree, first of all, with the premise of the question?
Look, it's a serious problem, and we've been commenting on this in the last week because there's been a bit of a smear campaign mounted from somewhere, and we're trying to narrow down where it's coming from.
A smear campaign targeting the female cadet involved?
Well, there certainly has been, and they've actually been, funnily enough, trying to pin it on us when we've been trying to do the opposite. But I think in this case, the real problem at ADFA was simply that the minister's first statement, where he overreacted slightly and threw petrol on the fire by saying that, by hearing the charge for the offences you mentioned, and they were exceptionally minor offences. That's how it became public. I don't think it was any conscious effort to pick on the victim of the incident. I think it was just an unfortunate side effect of the minister weighing in.
But what about, I mean, you weighed in as well. I mean, you went on the record and said, it's my understanding she's a bit of a troubled lass. I mean, that is an innuendo in itself, isn't it?
Well, it could be taken. It could be misconstrued that way, and certainly if I chose
it was misconstrued. If it wasn't what you intended, it certainly was misconstrued.
What did you mean?
Well, as I said at the time, I mean, she was a troubled lass because she'd had the previous charges. But I mean, I also said the lads were obviously troubled lads too. I mean, what people are forgetting here is that these are actually very young people who've made, a terrible mistake. Now, what they did to the girl in question was an absolute outrage. But we need to think quite carefully before we pillory everyone involved, because you need to hear both sides of the story. Now, I suspect that the fellow who's allegedly taken the photographs doesn't have a future in the Defence Force. I would suspect the six who watched probably don't either.
Can you understand why they're still continuing their studies now, while the woman involved has been forced to take leave? The commandant of the Defence Academy, he's been forced to take leave, and yet these seven.
Yep, we've actually asked this question, and because our understanding of the law is under the Defence Act, they could actually be suspended without infringing on their natural justice. But apparently it's got something to do with the blend of the criminal investigation and the administrative law. On the old legal principle, even scum have rights. But we have asked the question, how come they haven't been suspended? Because it doesn't look good, and it's also not good in terms of the justice of it.
But are we satisfied that in fact she was forced to take leave? I thought she elected to take leave.
Under very difficult circumstances. I don't think she had much choice at that particular point in time.
Well, no, that's an assumption that you make, Eva, and you could be quite right. But this goes to the whole issue of the fact that we don't know really what happened, and neither does the Minister.
But what we do know is that she's on leave and they're still in
yes, but she may have elected to go on leave. The explanation from Defence, as I understand it, as to why they are there is that the Australian Federal Police have not yet come up with a charge against these fellows. Now, I can't help that. We can't help that. And holding them all in defence, holding them all at the Defence Force Academy and on leave makes it very easy for the police to investigate.
I've got to ask you, were there incidents like this that you knew of when you were in charge of the whole range of defence colleges?
No, there weren't. We'd just been through, in about 98, a significant inquiry which I guess overcame a range of problems, and after that there was a period of time where I think the place ran relatively smoothly. Now, in my own defence, I didn't have any responsibility for these disciplinary kind of actions, but I watched them very closely, as we all did. And I guess what I'd say is that the Defence Force Academy has problems, but generally it does a good job.
Let's hear from Martina Jewell. I mean, you didn't go to ADFA. I think you went to Duntroon. But do these sort of incidents come as a complete shock to you, or did it look like something that you may have seen similar types of incidents occurring in your time?
Well, Tony, actually, I did go to ADFA
I beg your pardon. Okay.
And Duntroon. However, I served at ADFA as a cadet. Actually, I graduated 15 years ago from ADFA. And back in that period that Jim was just talking about, I was there from 94 to 96. So that inquiry actually came in after I was a cadet there. So there was definitely some issues or incidences at ADFA when I was a cadet, but these by and large were individuals, not the organisation as a whole, which I actually feel is actually what's happening here with this Skype incident. I think these are individuals, and to actually paint the entire culture of the Defence Force by the poor behaviour of some individuals, I don't think is particularly fair. I think the very vast majority of defence people are doing the right thing and serving our nation with honour and distinguish. And arguably we've got soldiers, sailors and airmen serving right now in countries around the world, and some of the most difficult environments to serve in, and the majority of our people are doing the right thing.
Let's just go back to the incident itself and to the question that was asked originally. Why is the real issue of sexual mistreatment of women clouded by innuendos about their character and personal lives? Do you see that this incident has been clouded by innuendos?
I think there's a lot of misinformation out there at the moment. I think it's quite clear that the facts, we don't have the facts, and whilst there's an inquiry underway at the moment, I don't think it's particularly helpful if I give my opinions on this either. So I think until we see all the facts of the situation and let Defence do their job in that process, and the AFP, and of course my heart goes out to the girl that's at the centre of this incident, because I think it's going to be a very difficult thing for her to deal with for the rest of her life.
Do you think, how hard would it be for her to go back now, knowing that those 7 young men at the centre of the thing, the ones who allegedly filmed this incident and sat and watched it, were still there studying?
Look, I don't know Kate and I don't know her personality, but I think it will be very difficult for her to go back to the academy, but not impossible, I think, given the support. But she'll have a hard road. Let's
bring Najeeba in. Have you been watching this story, and how does it look to you?
Yes, I have, and I found it very shocking as well, because coming from a country that has been involved for so many for decades, and living in a country like Australia, giving us teaching us what respect is about to a woman and how much they value women, and getting to hear an incident like this in the media, it actually shocked the hell out of me. And that's when I started asking myself, is this really true? And as Mitra was saying, it is an individual thing, and we should not actually start making judgment about two individual person in the cadet ADFA that has done this, and making an assumption that all the other vast majority of the Defence Army is the same, because we do have incredible Defence Army in Afghanistan that are giving up their lives to support young women, to support women, providing that safety and security to those women in Afghanistan.
Jim Molan, going back to what you were saying, let's go back to what you were saying before. It seemed that you were not satisfied by the amount of information that's come out in this story. Is there a lack of transparency about what's been going on in this college?
There is a lack of transparency, but I think a lot of that's driven by the fact that that the members of the staff and the Australian Defence Force members can't speak. Okay. The ministerial office requires that the only person that does the speaking is the minister, and I think that's very sad, because there is a perception out there that the minister spoke too early, that he spoke without knowing the facts, he spoke too publicly, and from then on he had to do things which kind of generally camouflaged the initial mistakes that he made. And for the Defence Force to not be able to come back, or not be willing to come back and argue their own case, I think is very sad.
Well, not be willing might be close to the point. We did ask them to come on this show. And
oh yes, but perhaps, you know, I'm sure they had to get the minister's permission to do it. Now, who made the decision? I don't know who made the decision.
All right, our next question, we'll move on. Our next question comes from Ananya Chakravorty.
The Defence Department is notorious for being secretive, hostile to inquiry and resistant to reform. Does Stephen Smith's expansive intervention agenda provide real scope for a change of the culture of the department?
Neil James.
Well, there's a few false assumptions in what you said there that you'd have to tackle. I mean, the Defence Association for decades has led calls for reform of the Department of Defence. The problem is there's too many people confuse and conflate two different things, the Department of Defence and the Defence Force. They're actually separate organisations, and most of the things that go wrong in Defence are in the department, not in the Defence Force, and that's not widely known in Australian society anymore, because the Australian people no longer get their own Defence Force. They just literally don't understand it, because so few Australians...
Except in this case, what went wrong is with cadets training to be part of the Defence Force. So...
Exactly. I mean, no one's trying to downplay this incident, but there is a lot of simplistic coverage of it, and media coverage of defence issues in this country, generally speaking, hovers somewhere between poor and appalling, and over the last week it's been worse than appalling. The amount of sensationalism and mistakes and fibs in the press have just been unbelievable. Now, the Minister has slowly drip-fed out the facts to protect his own reputation, and most of the things that the press are still running are things the Minister denied a week ago, but the press still does it. And that's why a lot of people are so outraged about this incident, because they're relying on the false information put out there. And as we've said all along, if the Commandant of ADFA had been able to stand up in front of a television camera on the first day and explain exactly what happened, we wouldn't have had half the problems we're having. But they're gagged by the Minister for political reasons. Now, the Defence Association for a very long time has criticised the media organisation in the Department of Defence and to an extent the Defence Force. And we've also criticised the fact that there are virtually no professional defence correspondents in Australia anymore who cover it on a permanent basis and know what they're talking about.
Eva Cox.
I think I'm going to put my sociologist hat on this thing. I mean, defence, we're getting absolutely into that situation where we're getting into the minutiae of who said what and who did it in front of this and that's classic defensiveness, if you like. It happens every time. I've been actually doing a lot of reading. I've had a lot of emails. I've had a lot of feedback from various people, including some that have been on the various programs. There is a problem with the Defence Force. There's a problem that they don't seem to be able to manage to order the right defence material in various things. There's a cover-up sort of way things are. I'm not saying that the people in the Defence Force, I think they do an excellent job, the people that we've got out there fighting. I'm in no way being critical of them. But I would say that on almost every criterion, including some of the rules that they've got about, there's a rule that says if you say something that brings the Defence Force into disrepute, you can get up to 3 months' jail. I mean, it is not an open society. It is not an organisation which is open to criticism. It defends itself furiously, and the way they've attacked the Minister over the last few weeks, I think, is a further indication.
I don't think the Defence Force has attacked the Minister in any way, shape or form.
Absolutely. I'm sorry.
Neil and I might have, but the Defence Force has not.
Well, let's say that certainly there is a lack of openness about what goes wrong in the Defence Force. Everything you read,
Well, I don't think that's correct, Eva. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I spent today sitting down reading the various reports. You cannot find a list of the number of complaints and where they've come from anywhere in your annual reports. You cannot find half the time when you try and get through and find out have a look at what the actual complaints procedures is. It tells you can't get through on the website. There's reports going back to the one that you were mentioning, that you were both talking about in the 90s, and there's people saying, including one of the present ADFA people, saying the reform stuff has stopped. It is a closed institution. It is not an open institution. It has to be, to some degree, a closed institution. And I think the fact that you keep trying to drag it down to who said what in front of things is a perfect example of what's closed.
Let's hear from... Let's hear from Jim Molan on the question. The Defence Force is notorious for being secretive, hostile to inquiry and resistant to reform. And the question was, do Stephen Smith's interventions provide scope for change?
Well, I think that the fact
Bearing in mind, I think there are 6 inquiries.
I think there are 6 inquiries too, quite astounding.
But none of them are looking at the role of the Minister.
No, absolutely.
He's rigged the terms
Why
of
would
reference.
you look at the role of the Minister?
Because there's a thing, Eva, called the Constitution and the Defence Act. And civil control of the military, right, doesn't allow the Minister to have unfettered control. We live in a democratic system where the Minister has to conform with the Constitution and the Defence Act. Last week...
The minute he makes a criticism, you have a go at the Minister, and you keep telling me...
Because what he did was wrong, Eva.
So can I just...
The Defence Act applies to him as much as it applies to every member of the Defence Force.
Neil James, we do still have civilian control of the military in this country, don't we? I mean, isn't that what the Minister is in charge of?
Tony, if I can correct you there's no such thing. We have civil control of the military. And civil control of the military is a very important constitutional principle. And you won't get anyone in the Defence Force who has ever argued against it. But civil control has to be exercised properly. Now, what's happened is the Minister contravened the Defence Act and he contravened certain principles of administrative law. First of all, by pillaring the Commandant of ADFA and not giving the man any rights. And that's why we got stuck in, because a man's human rights have been violated. And also because he attempted to quash a disciplinary proceeding. Now, if the Minister for Social Security tried to quash a proceeding in the Social Security Appeals Tribunal, everyone would say that's an infringement of the separation of powers.
Okay,
and the Minister
Neil, I'm going to interrupt you. There's a hand that's shot up in the front, and I'm going to go to the audience.
I want to make the point that all this talk about the Minister this and the Minister that and the way you're talking to Eva seems to me to be illustrating the entire problem, which is that you don't want to talk about the culture of the Defence Force.
Oh, no, I'm happy to talk about the culture of the Defence Force. Very happy to talk about it.
Okay, let's talk about it.
Very happy to talk about it, and it's about time we got onto it.
What are your thoughts about the culture of the Defence Force?
My thoughts on the culture of the Defence Force is that there is not one culture, there's any number of cultures. Anyone who says, as we've seen people commenting in the media in the last couple of days, is that we have a sexist culture. That's an extraordinarily simplistic approach to what we do and what we are. If a culture is a set of values and ideas which an organisation subscribes to, and, we've been called misogynist, and what's a misogynist? Someone who hates women as a group. To say that the Australian Defence Force, as an organisation, because they have a culture, hates women as a group, when 12% of us are women, is just bizarre. Now, we have problems, but to take an individual activity, a single incident, maybe a number of incidents, and generalise to what we're seeing at the moment, the culture of the Defence Force. There is not one culture of the Defence Force.
There's a secretive culture of the Defence Force.
Ah, OK. So what you're saying, Eva, you're saying is some parts of the Defence Force are secretive. I absolutely agree with you, and that's the way you should say it.
Jim, just hang on. We've got another hand that's come up in the front there.
Can I just comment as well that we've had, in relation to the male cadet at the centre of this inquiry and Kate, we've heard Neil talk about him as a man who's had his human rights violated. And
no,
Kate
that wasn't who I was talking about. I was talking about the Commandant of ADFA, who was the second victim of the incident.
All right, fair enough. But Kate has been referred to as someone who's taken leave, as though she's gone to Hawaii for a week. But as I understood it, she was vilified, had shaving cream sprayed on her bed, was called skank, slut, whore, all sorts of other mannerisms. This isn't someone who's just taken leave. This is someone who's been forced out. You can't, this is not normal circumstances. This is a teenage girl we're dealing with. And surely to talk about her in those flippant terms illustrates exactly what Ava was saying, is that we always blame the women and we always turn on them.
Fair enough. I don't always blame the women. My understanding is that she elected to take leave. Now, of course, it was pretty awful for her. It was pretty awful for her. There's no two ways about it. But she, as I think Eva said, she was forced on leave. No, she wasn't forced on leave. She elected to take leave.
So, can I just ask you, who do you think is to blame here?
In relation to what, Tony?
This incident.
There's enough blame to go around. I would start with the fellow who did what he did, which made me ashamed to be both a man and a soldier. Absolutely ashamed. From then on, I think she just rocketed out of control. Totally out of control.
You mean the incident?
The incident. Totally out of control.
Got a gentleman with his cane in the air, in fact.
As an ex-member of the Defence Force, General Moylan, don't you think it was wrong the way they broke up the Defence Department in '72, going from where you had a separate Minister for the Navy, Minister for the Air and Minister for the Army? Don't you think just give it to one man? I think it... Neil might agree with me or disagree with me, but I could see trouble there at the time they split up the department in a separate group. You can laugh as much as you like, Eva, but there are a lot of servicemen that were against that inquiry.
Okay.
It goes back to the Morshead inquiry of 1959, set up by the Menzies government.
Thank you very much. It's an eloquent comment, and I'll take it as a comment. There is more than one incident. We've got a tweet from Dan Hope. The ADF will always cover their own, how about the disgusting homophobic Facebook pages? Jim?
Absolutely. Oh, well, absolutely disgusting. And of course, you can go from the particular, 100 people registered on that Facebook. I would balance that with a statement made by a member who says he's openly gay, that this is not the normal thing in defence. So, what you've got there is someone saying that this goes to the defence culture. We're homophobic as well as being misogynist. I mean, there can't be many people that we don't like left in the world, as far as I can see.
So why did it take so long to clear up the Facebook? I mean, the fact is, things go wrong. I'm not denying things go wrong. These kids have been in the army a relatively short time. They reflect a lot of outside attitudes. A homophobic thing happens. But it takes forever. How many months since the homophobic thing was actually, since somebody actually complained about it? And it's been week after week after week and nothing happens.
But I think someone's actually got to investigate these things.
Martina wants to come in here, so I'm going to interrupt to allow her to do that.
Eva, that I think, again, there's a situation here with the facts that we're not clear of what's coming out in the media, of how long this has been identified as an issue, what types of inquiries or investigations were in play. I think everyone who has read those statements is absolutely horrified. I certainly was, what I saw on that Facebook page and in the media. But again, I would say that this is, again, individuals or isolated incidences from my experience of 15 years in the Army. I've served with gays who have had great careers, and I fully agree with Jim that this is an incident that I think isn't reflective of the entire culture of the ADF. OK, well, we're having a passionate discussion, as you can see. You're watching Q&A. Remember, you can send your web or video questions to our website. The address is on the screen to see how to do that. Our next question is a video. It comes from Ravina Tor in Bruce in the ACT.
My question's to Neil James. You've recently expressed in the media that you object to women serving on the front line based on physical capability. However, there are no doubt women who could pass the required physical and intellectual requirements that exist for the currently serving men, just as there are men who can't. Do you disagree?
Well, I actually disagree with the question. The question's wrong. The Defence Association for years has championed the cause of females in the Defence Force, and the person who sent that question in obviously hasn't gone to our website and bothered to read
including serving on the front line. I think that
well, women are serving on the front line now, and
but in the jobs that they're not allowed into.
That's not true, Eva. We get very, very angry when incompetent journalists and politicians say there are no women on the front line.
No.
Now, when I was up in December, up in Afghanistan in December, I'm not ducking the question at all. When I was up in Afghanistan in December, the number of women who said to me, Jamesy, why are we so invisible to the people of Australia? We keep getting told by journalists.
There are still some jobs that are barred for women, aren't they?
Can I finish without being interrupted?
No, because that was a real question.
Because they say, we're up here serving in the front line. Why do people keep saying that we don't exist? And it's really, really annoying when people keep saying that women can't serve in combat and in the front line in Australia when they're doing it as we sit at this table now. And Martina will back me up on this.
Let's go to Eva Cox first.
I just want to know what your view is on the jobs that are still barred for women.
No, actually, you're not asking the questions, I'm afraid. The audience is doing that, and occasionally I'll do that. But I'd like you to address the question that was asked, which is about women in frontline services. And I guess I'm interested from your point of view, because as a feminist, you might have thought you were against war completely. But it sounds like you actually would like to see women on the front lines.
I think if we're going to have front lines, if we're going to have combat duties, women need to be able to take on any of the duties that they are appropriately equipped to do.
And we would agree with that.
Yeah, and that means every job should be available to any woman. There should be no jobs that are barred for women, because it seems to me ridiculous. We have to take the risks. Now, I mean, I might have problems about which front lines and where they are and what we're doing there in the first place, but I can't see any rational way why women who can meet the things there, because when you start carrying on in the way that people, what happens when you've got them in the trenches, and, you know, what happens when they've got their periods, what happens in these things there. I mean, these are all irrelevancies. If they can pass the physical tests, they should be able to do any of the jobs, and at the moment, and that's what I was trying to get Neil to say.
Do you want them to, though? I mean, this is the interesting thing from my point of view.
Do I want them to? I don't want anybody to do these jobs if we can avoid it, but if we can't, they ought to have their share.
So is it a new feminist aspiration for women to have the right to kill and the right to die on the front lines? Because
I mean, the feminist movement is a broad church, and you will find a variety of views, not always ones that I agree with or don't agree with.
Didn't you used to march with the slogan, take the toys away from the boys, in anti-war demonstrations?
Yes, but I mean, I might be anti-war, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually anti-women being taking their share of the responsibilities if we're in war. I mean, there's different wars, there's just wars, there's arguments about what's a just war, and we're not getting into those here and then. But I don't think I have ever supported the idea that women should be treated differentially. If they're capable of lugging the packs, if they're capable of climbing into the planes, if they're capable of working the machinery, they should have the same chance that men have. They should take the same risk that men have, and maybe then it will be much harder for men to sort of see them as a separate category.
I'll come to Martina in a second. I want to hear from najeeba first on this. What are your thoughts about women serving as frontline soldiers?
I think women should be allowed to take on all roles in the service, including the frontline combat. It's excluding the physiological anatomy debate about the the upper body strength versus the lower body system. Equal rights should be maintained for everybody, for men and women. If a woman chooses to sign up for the army in the front line, she should be allowed to do so. The gender issue should not come into anything. If a woman, the attitude, such attitude in our society should not exist that sex become an issue. If a woman chooses to go and fight in the front line, she should be allowed to. Our history has shown so far, even we have Mitna here, that women can be great in the front line combats. We have strong women who can be great pilots, better than men, and we have men who can be good pilots in handling heavy bombers. So it's not... In our society, it's becoming more of a female and male thing. This is how the society is trying to portray it. But at the end of the day, they're both equal, and they both should have the right to choose whether to be in the frontline combat or not.
All right, let's hear from Martina now, because you actually did find yourself on the front line, but in someone else's war, and where you were very badly injured, as it turns out.
That's right. Look, I think there's a lot of misinformation and confusion around this issue. So if I can try and clarify a couple of points. Firstly, in modern battle, the front line is not clearly identifiable. And as a result, women have been involved in combat for at least the last decade. So we already have women serving in combat, as Neil pointed out. And so I think the terminology around this debate saying women in combat, if we actually talked about women in the 7% of jobs that at the moment are physically standards that don't allow women to go into that area.
What about, I mean, for example, should the SAS be open to women recruits?
I think all the jobs in the military should be have testing done for intellectual capability, the physical standards and the skill sets required for each and every one of those jobs. And if women pass those criteria, and I don't think there should be a lowering of those standards, imperatively those physical standards must remain. But if women are capable and pass those standards, then in principle I support women serving in every role.
Let's hear from Jim Molan. Do you see a future with women serving in the SAS?
I see a future with women serving in what I call close combat units for the simple reason that it would appear that the minister has decided it. And I think this is the issue.
Has he decided wrongly, in your view?
I don't think we know enough to make that decision because we're talking about two separate things here. We're talking about women in combat, which we're all in violent agreement at this table. Everyone is saying, well, they are. They're in combat now. They can do it. Women can do combat. The big question that we've got to address...
Agreement should never be violent.
Oh, OK, well, I think we are. The big question is does Australian society want women to serve in units whose specific focus is to kill at close quarters? And there aren't too many of those units. Mainly they're infantry type units. They're armoured type units, and there's some engineering type units that act as infantry and do that. And I think that's the issue.
Is there a reason, Jim, in your mind, why they should not? In units that kill at close quarters?
There is a reason why they aren't at the moment, in that at the moment we have 10,000 years of history of males fighting in those units, and we don't have any history yet to say whether it will work with women. I don't know whether it will, and those that say that women should have the right to serve in, not in combat, everyone's agreed they're in combat, should have the right to serve in units whose main function is close combat, I suspect don't know much about close combat. And I think that's the problem. Now, I'm not anti it, by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not anti it, but I think this is a decision that shouldn't be made by the government, shouldn't be made by the minister, should not be made by a lobby group, for the simple reason that this is a philosophical and ethic issue that should be addressed by society.
I'm just going to... Neil, I'll come to you in a minute, but I just want to hear from Eva Cox whether you believe women should be involved in units with close combat and killing at close quarters.
If we have them, they should be there, and I can't see why this is a particular... I think it's an ethical issue whether we kill. I think it's an issue whether we kill, under what circumstances we kill, but I don't think it's an ethical issue whether you happen to have the double X or XY chromosomes. I mean, I can't see that that's got anything to do with it.
Neil James.
Well, the problem with it, Eva, is that if you bother to keep up with your reading, you'd understand that what you think isn't the... There are two extremes in this argument, unfortunately. The extreme of social conservatives and World War II diggers who say no women should ever be on the front line, and there is another extreme, and dare I say it, Eva, you're possibly on that extreme, which says that all women should be able to do every job in the military at all times, irrespective of the circumstances.
I did not say that. That's right. Don't misquote me. I just said if they passed a test, they should do it.
The current policy is government policy. It's not defence policy, and it's essentially based on three things: physicality, biomechanics, and the laws of probability.
And genetics.
No, it's not based on genetics at all.
Well, why do you bar women in that case if it's not based on genetics?
Well, I don't bar women at all. And in fact, if you bothered to read what we say on our website, you'd understand our policy. The problem is if you put women in the front line, and the current policy basically says women can serve in the front line in every job, even jobs involving close quarter combat, as long as they don't do it on a continuous basis. Because the law of probability says if they do it on a continuous basis, you will have disproportionate female casualties to men. Now, one of the ironies of this argument, when people don't actually read into it, is simply that by putting women in every single combat job, you could actually disproportionately kill women quite significantly. How would that be an equitable outcome?
Why would they be killed more often than men?
Because you would be making them fight enemy men day in, day out on a continuous basis. Now, it wouldn't matter how good the female infantryman was, over time you are likely to suffer more female casualties than male casualties.
Okay. I think you've got a very low opinion of women.
I'd just like to hear whether Martina agrees with that logic, and then we'll move on.
I think it goes back to if they've got the skills to pass those testing standards, then in principle I support women being in those roles. They've got to have those physical skills, the same as the men. Not all men pass these tests because they're very high standards, and there'll be a small percentage of women that could.
I agree entirely, but there's one minor problem, and that is simply that the weight of public expectation and the professionalism of our female soldiers may require them to volunteer for these jobs where they're killed disproportionately. And I keep saying to the radical feminists, how is that equitable? If you are going to kill women in greater numbers than men, how is that fair to the women?
What proof do you have that they'll be killed more often than men if you're going to keep asserting that? I mean, that's crap. You're just making an assertion.
Okay, there's a simple... If I could... If I could get a word in edgeways...
If you could keep it brief, because...
Well, it's quite simple, right? We all accept that all our top NRL and AFL teams are all filled entirely by men. Yet no one bats an eyelid about that. Well, the battlefield's a lot more dangerous than the sporting field either. And if you accept that our top-grade sports teams are all men, and you accept that mixed-gender teams like netball have rules about how many men you can have in the team, why is the battlefield, which is lethal, somehow different? How can you ignore
sport.
history?
It is not sport, and we actually have to recognise
all right.
Exactly, it's war, and war kills people.
I think we're agreed if women played NRL, they get killed more often. Let's move on. You're watching Q&A, where you can send in your questions by text or video at the Q&A website. Our next question tonight comes from Jane Hunter. Where's Jane?
Just over here.
There's Jane. Go ahead, Jane.
Thank you, Tony. Najeeba, you are an example of a young person who has escaped Afghanistan and is achieving success. Do you believe that Australia and its allies are doing enough to help defeat the Taliban and are therefore making Afghanistan a better place? And has the situation for women improved, and can young girls now go to school?
The current situation in Afghanistan has been highlighted within the media, and I think everybody is quite aware that even though since the Taliban has collapsed, we still do not have that safety and security for our people to live in the country, and as a result, we can see that more asylum seekers are coming by boat to Australia. And just answering your question, most definitely yes. The troops in Afghanistan are providing safety and security for our people in Afghanistan. Just by the presence, just by them being in our country, we have been able to achieve great things for our people, and it includes our installment of the new government and the past 4 parliamentary elections that we have held so far. And by the troops being in Afghanistan, we have actually provided more safety and security for those women and young girls to attend school, colleges and universities, which could have been impossible to achieve.
Is that happening throughout Afghanistan, though? I mean, or is it locked into certain pockets of safety like Kabul, or relative safety like
I believe it's locked up in places like Kabul, because Kabul is the capital city of Afghanistan, where more troops are there. So the presence of troops are more present in Kabul rather than in villages like Bamiyan. That's where I'm from, where the roads are still trafficked by the Taliban. People cannot use those roads to travel around to go from Ghazni to Bamiyan, because the Taliban is everywhere, because the troops are still not present in those villages. So it is pocket villages that you're talking about.
What are you hearing about the situation in those areas for women?
Recently, I actually thought that the position for women has been changed a little bit. We've actually have achieved a greater rights for our women. But unfortunately, hearing from my grandfather, who has recently arrived from Afghanistan to Australia, I've actually been notified with massive negative and depressing news about what actually is occurring to our women. Our women are still denied by our men to go and have equal participation in public life. Our women are still denied from access to education. Our women are still the prisoners of their sex. That's basically what women is in Afghanistan. And recently, just about 2 weeks before, our minister for Hazara people came from Afghanistan to Australia. And I myself, I've had I went along with a few other guests to a conference to sit with him and talk about the current situation of women in Afghanistan. And I was actually shut down by him not to ask any question as a woman. So that was another indication for me that in Australia he actually shut me off. So God knows what he would have done to me in Afghanistan.
Jim Mullen, let's get your perspective on this. How successful is the intervention, is the war in Afghanistan in changing the situation overall, particularly for women, as the questioner asked?
I think we converted what should have been a 2-year war into a 10-year war by the fact that we lost focus on it. We didn't put the right resources in. And I think we have, in the last 5 months, we, meaning the West, and in particular the Americans, have probably put in enough resources now so that there is a fair chance of us being successful. If in the case of what we are, the West, we are the interventionist forces, And success for the interventionist forces is to put the Afghans into a position where they, in fact, can win or lose the Afghan war sometime in the next 10 or 20 years.
That's impossible.
Yep, no, fair enough. I certainly hope that the Afghans can go ahead and can win their war. I mean, we're not going to win the Afghan war.
But
the Afghans are going to win the war, lose the war themselves.
How are we going to win the war when we are all actually witnessing many troops are still dying? Just recently, a Taliban member who actually came within the Afghan Defense Army and came with uniform, and he was successful in killing 10 soldiers, 5 Afghan soldiers and 5 from the foreign soldiers. So that's still an indication that can we still do it on our own?
No, you can't at the moment. You can't at the moment.
And the underlying issue is that our police, the Afghan Defense Army, still have problems themselves in trusting one another to protect people who do not trust them either. That's one big issue. I
think we're agreeing. I think we're agreeing with each other. What I'm saying is that the interventionist forces need to be there till a time in which the Afghans can take over and run their own country and run their own war. That's our definition of success.
Do you have any idea how long that might take, Jim?
I thought we were lucky to get to 2014. I thought we'd roll. No, I agree. I think it'll be longer.
I don't think that President Hamid Karzai will be able to provide the security by 2014.
This would make it the longest war Australia's ever been involved with.
Well, we've been in and out of this war a number of times, I've got to say. We haven't been there since 2001. But, yeah, and I think that's a characteristic of the wars that we're involved in at the moment. They are long wars and they're not easily defined as to the end state.
I just want to hear from Eva Cox. Do you talked earlier about just wars being wars, I presume, which you think women could fight in. Is Afghanistan a just war?
I think the problem with Afghanistan is that we went in there under fairly difficult circumstances. We've stayed there under even more difficult circumstances, and there are very serious doubts, which I think Najeeba's just been expressing, as to whether or not we're getting anywhere. So, I mean, the point about it is, you know, they got rid of the Russians, they've got rid of every single group that's walked in on it.
Right,
whether it's just or unjust, I think it's an extraordinarily difficult war to actually work out.
We've got another question that relates to this, and it comes from Mark Goodcamp.
Yeah, Australia's memorandum of understanding with the Afghan government to forcibly return so-called failed asylum seekers from Afghanistan has been criticised by many Afghan MPs and also by human rights, refugee advocates and trade unions in Australia. Why do you think it is that Australia is persisting with this policy, which is adding to the angst of Afghan asylum seekers in detention, when the conditions in Afghanistan are still incredibly dangerous, especially for the Hazara minority?
Najeeba, we'll start with you. I mean, this is about sending Afghan refugees, back to Afghanistan. There are certain parts of Afghanistan where the government is now beginning to conclude it's safe to send people back. What do you say?
Going back to the memorandum, I've actually had a visit myself with Mr. Anwar, who's the Minister of Refugee and Repatriation from Afghanistan. I've actually sit down with him after he signed the memorandum with Chris Ban, and I've asked him personally myself that how can he assure the safety and security of these people once they're returned. And to be honest, I was actually in shock when he didn't know what he has actually signed. Till he actually returned back to Afghanistan, by one of the ABC reporters, he actually stated and said, I did not sign for a memorandum to state that asylum seekers should be returned to Afghanistan involuntarily. And the fact and evidence is still in conflict till he actually abolished himself along with other parliament members that the safety and security can never be provided to Hazaras in particular. Because
well, I mean, you are in Hazara. The
Yes.
Home province is Bamiyan province, and there have been suggestions that province is relatively safe right now.
Well, once again, if this is what we want to believe, it's different to what we actually hear from people who are there and who are still living. I'm in contact with my own relatives back in Afghanistan, and this is not what I hear. This is what I see in media, but this is not what I hear. I definitely think if the country was safe, if the villages were safe, especially villages where there not many troops are present, people would not risk their lives in coming by boat to a country like Australia. Like, it's impossible.
Yeah. Jim, can I get your perspective on that, and whether you think it's a reasonable thing for the government to have signed a memorandum of understanding to begin sending Afghans back from Australia to provinces in Afghanistan? I have absolutely no public view on that at all. However, I must do your private view. No, you're not getting my private view. However, it's going to take a long time to make Afghanistan secure, so that everyone will assume that can be assured that they can safely return home. It's going to take a long time because we've decided to put in a limited number of resources, mainly troops. Therefore, it's going to take an extraordinarily long time to achieve a level of security in this country. OK, I'm going to move on because we've got quite a few... Well, in fact, we've got a gentleman with his hand up in the front row there. We'll come to you. We'll just wait till the microphone reaches you.
Just to Najeeba here, I was wondering, as a refugee, do you think that Australian politics and maybe parts of the Australian society could be more informed about the absolute horrors that you have been through, and that maybe from this they can become more considerate and stuff, and we can have less inconsiderate phrases like "stop the boats" from Mr. Abbott, for example?
I think refugees issue in Australia has become a political game. We're not talking about human beings. We're not talking about people's faces that could be the sisters, mothers or daughters of people back in the country who are in war. We constantly hear in the media about the number of arrival of boats. We're not talking about the real human face. And I think the best way to tackle this is to give those refugees a chance to be heard. Once the real words come out, once they get to share their personal stories, I think the mutual respect and understanding will come.
All right. I'm going to just bring in, we've got a sceptical question from Alan Gauci, and I'd like to hear from Alan.
Najeeba, your parents chose to pay the people smugglers to come into Australia. Are you aware that Julia Gillard and most Australians, they do not like queue jumpers because queue jumpers, they deny a to other genuine refugees?
Okay, I would definitely, I've came across this question several times about how Australia is actually trying to define us, either by numbers, either by queue jumpers, either by anchor children. And in order to answer your question, we are not queue jumpers. I will give you a very clear example of to make it easier for you to have a clear view of the situation that we were in Afghanistan. Just imagine yourself that you live in a room where the room is in fire, and even though you know the right exit towards that room is the door, but you see the window is open, so you will take the window to jump out of that fire to survive. That's what we did. We had to get the closest way, and like today, Australia is trying to show us the right pathway to be called the legal migrants. But what is legal migrants? Coming by airplane? Or UNHCR doesn't even exist in countries like Afghanistan. How would people go and apply for those applications which get processed by years? Will people survive by then? That's the question.
I start with Eva Cox. Your family came here as refugees in 1948, was it?
Yes. I was a post-war refugee from Nazi Germany, so I do have some understanding of what happens around refugees and what happens when countries actually knock back refugees, as they did before the war, including Australia, that they wouldn't take them. And I wouldn't be here if Arthur Calwell had paid any attention to public opinion polls, because in 1947 there was a public opinion poll that said, "Do not let Jewish refugees into Australia, they will never fit in." And I arrived in 1948. So if you want us to follow public opinion, I wouldn't have been here. You might think it's a good idea, but I think a lot of other people might disagree with you. There was no queue. And I think the point that Najeeba is making is there is no queue, there is no thing. There was actually an incident, I think, when Crikey tried to ring the embassy in you know, in Afghanistan to find out how you actually applied for refugee status, and it said you had to ring Canberra. I mean, you know, it's not very good in a village in Afghanistan if you have to ring Canberra to put your name on the things. There is no queue. There was no queue. We are behaving abominably as far as this stuff goes. The reason that people are worried about the fact that people are queue jumpers is because people use that phrase. There are no queue jumpers if there is no queue. And the government is actually using this as a political football, and the opposition is even more so as a political football. And the result is that people are dying because of that. And people are sort of standing on roofs of things. I just think we are behaving appallingly. If the government hadn't decided in the first place to bring people to Christmas Island, if they'd have just brought them to the mainland in the first place and had a decent system of doing it, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in.
All right, I want to hear from Neil Jones on this.
Look, the Defence Association's followed the refugee argument again for many years, and the problem is, quite frankly, that arguments on both sides of it in Australia are essentially arguing about symptoms and not the cause. The cause is actually the Refugee Convention itself. There are only 7 countries between the Aegean and Arafura Seas who take refugees, and they include, and this is funny, Iran, Afghanistan, Yemen, Israel, Cambodia and East Timor. So they're all sources of refugees rather than sanctuary. Until more countries in our region sign up to the convention, we're going to continue to have a problem in this country politically. And you'll get extremes in the debate. You know, our position is simply...
Can I just say, the question was about queue jumpers. Do you accept the term queue jumpers?
The Defence Association doesn't accept the term queue jumpers, but we do accept there's a problem in that there are millions and millions of refugees who are left to fester in the third world who cannot escape. Now, we staff our hospitals and our engineering firms by bleeding off the educated middle class who are needed back in those countries to rebuild them. So that there's some interesting moral challenges either way. And a lot of Vietnam veterans, for example, and I personally don't agree with this argument, will say to you, why are young Australian men dying in Afghanistan while young Afghan men are fleeing to Australia? Now, there are some terrible moral dilemmas in this area, but the problem is, on both extremes of the debate in Australia, people are essentially arguing about the symptoms, and they won't go back and look at what is actually causing the refugee flows in the world. And the Refugee Convention was designed so neighbouring countries would solve the problem that causes the refugee flow in the first place. But by having extra regional flows, the Refugee Convention is totally broken down. Okay. And until it's fixed, we're going to continue to have a permanent problem.
I'm sorry, we're really nearly running out of time. We've got time for one last question. This is Q&A. It's live and interactive. Next question, and it will be our last question, comes from Marilyn Pigeon.
Anzac Day has reached legendary status in almost the last 100 years. What does the panel feel is the future of Anzac Day, and how can we make Anzac Day more inclusive of new migrants that have not been raised in the culture of the digger and mateship as Australians are?
Let's. I'll go for Martina first, because I know you're on the committee that's working on the 100th anniversary of Anzac Day. So just reflect on the question, if you can.
It's a very good question. I think, as my role as one of the commission members of the 6 commissioners for the Anzac centenary coming up from 2014 to 2018, one of the things we actually have looked at and recommended to government is to look at how Anzac Day resonates with all Australians from our multicultural society. We're also looking at how Anzac Day resonates with all people, looking at other things outside of the First World War, Second World War, and those popular areas that are, people generally know about in our military history. Because our military history has played an undeniable role in shaping our nation and also connecting with who we are as Australians.
Let's hear from Najeeba, because I guess in some ways the question's addressed to you, a relatively new Australian. So how do you understand this National Day, Anzac Day?
I think for me personally, it took me a few years to realise what Anzac Day was about. The first few years living in Australia, I haven't had the opportunity to learn about the history of Australia. But once I was actually went to school and started learning about Anzac Day, I started to realise about the importance of this day. And I believe Anzac Day should be remembered, not only by Australians, but also by migrants and refugees that are coming to Australia, because at the end of the day, these people who have lost their lives have somehow contributed in creating peace in our life. And that's what we're grateful for.
Jim, where do you think Anzac Day will go? Where will it be in 10 years, 20 years?
Well, I guess the question we've all got to ask ourselves is where will Australia be in 10 or 20 years? And I find Anzac Day, as someone who's lived in this country all his life and who's served and is a veteran, Anzac Day is a very complicated day for me because I'm prepared on Anzac Day, which is the only day in the year I'm prepared to say that Australian soldiers are without doubt the best soldiers in the world. Sailors and airmen, we're the best soldiers, sailors and airmen and women in the world. Every other day of the year, I'm brutally honest about our capabilities. But it's lovely to hear Najeeba say what she said. I think it's fantastic that the next generation, and there are different generations coming through, and every generation has had problems settling into the country. Anzac Day is a focus for we Australians, and I think that we Australians, for all our faults, should acknowledge, let's twist what has been put to Americans for years. We should see something about Australian exceptionalism. We are an extraordinary country, and that's the reason why so many people want to come here. And I reckon if we know why we are so good, what we offer to the world, then we know exactly what our strengths are.
Eva Cox.
I think it's very important that we maintain an inclusive Anzac Day. I think when Anzac Day becomes, we're better than you type stuff, that and it can sometimes do that this becomes a problem. I think given the fact that there are so many different groups coming in with different histories and different things, the idea that we have some point where we celebrate and thank people for the contributions they've made towards our nation is really important. But we have to recognise that it's got to be one that includes recent arrivals, it includes Aboriginal people that we've only just started recognising, and it includes the people sometimes that were on the other side. And I think what's really interesting about Anzac Day is the way that the Turks and the Australians have actually started bridging across the fact that they were on opposite sides. And I think that that's one of the lessons that we have to learn and remember from Anzac Day, is that both sides need to celebrate what happens and and be good citizens about it.
Neil James, we're almost out of time, but final word to you.
Well, two quick points. One is the Australian people never think about their Defence Force on a day-to-day basis except on Anzac Day, and then they think about it historically, and that's one of the reasons why defence spending is often neglected. But secondly, Anzac Day is a day for veterans and the community. It's not a day for the Defence Force. And unfortunately, it's become more and more of a militarised Defence Force Day, and I personally think that's wrong. I don't think any formed units of the Defence Force should march on Anzac Day ever, unless they've just returned from a war zone, for example. It's a day very much for veterans to share among themselves and to share with the community, and unfortunately it's becoming a bit militarised, and I think that's wrong.
Well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for, believe it or not. We've run out of time. Please thank our panel, Eva Cox, Neil James, Martina Jewell, Najeeba Wazifadost and Jim Molan. OK. So this Thursday night from 8:30 p.m. we'll have an extra edition of Q&A presenting a documentary on Australia's romance with Elizabeth II. And then we'll open the Q&A debate to consider Australia's constitutional future. Will it be a republic or a monarchy? And we'll be back again next Monday at 9:35 with a very special edition of Q&A, broadcasting from regional Australia for the first time. Q&A will be live from the Albury Entertainment Centre with a passionate audience of regional Australians and a panel that includes the Minister for Regional Australia, Simon Crean, the Shadow Minister for Industry and local member for the regional seat of Indi in Northern Victoria, Sophie Mirabella, and the Independent Member for New England, Tony Windsor, whose role in our hung parliament has put regional Australia back on top of the national agenda. Both editions, I'm sure, will be fascinating. Please join us on Thursday and then on Monday for more live and lively Q&As. Until then, good night.